Welcome to All Those Kings. Last week, for those of you that were not here, or just as a review, this will be on the final exam in a few weeks, so I do want to get through it. We were talking about the origin of kingship in Israel. The unfortunate conventional wisdom today, liberal scholars, and of course the secular world would argue that the kings, especially Saul, David, and Solomon, didn't exist. They are fictions, and that the city of Jerusalem was not a functional major city at the time that these stories took place, and that the kingship that we talk about begins basically after the time of Solomon. And so my thrust in this particular class for the next several weeks is to try to show you that Saul, David, and Solomon were real people. And we're going to be looking at the historical and the archaeological support for those particular points. And last week we talked about the origin of kingship. Why was there a king? If you read the text, you'll find that the Israelites had been existing in Canaan for 200 years after the conquest as individual tribes. And around the time of Samuel, they went to Samuel and said, "We want a king." And the question is, why did they want a king? What changed things? And that's what we talked about last week. Primarily, the reason was the arrival of the Philistines. And let's take a look at that. The text says, this is during the time of the judges. There was this rise and fall in faith, and they kept falling away. It says, again, the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, so the Lord delivered them into the hands of the Philistines for 40 years. And I would argue that that may not be 39 plus 1, an actual 40. That's a symbolic number repeatedly in the Bible, and it would mean a generation or a long time. But for a while, the Philistines had control over the Israelites, and we were told that Samson was born as a Nazirite, dedicated as a Nazirite by his mother, which is unusual. A Nazirite, that's not a Nazarene, a person from Nazareth. A Nazirite is a person who is dedicating a period of time to do some kind of perhaps penance to the Lord. Generally, it was a 30-day period. If you were a Nazirite, you didn't cut your hair, you didn't imbibe alcohol, and you didn't become unclean by handling dead bodies. Those were the three basic rules. And you did that for 30 days, and that was your decision. For a mother to dedicate a newborn to God for his lifetime is a little bit unusual, and in those particular cases, the requirements would be a little bit different. But in Samson's case, in exchange for living a life of a Nazirite and not cutting his hair, for example, he was given extreme strength. And he was able to use that, I would argue, to basically provoke the relationship between the Philistines and the Israelites. Of course, he had his hair cut, and that led to other problems. But we were told that Samson would begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines. This is something that would continue on up through the time of David, actually. And it says that Samson led Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines. And in those days, Israel had no king. At the time of Samson, there was no king. They were ruled by judges and priests and in individual tribal units. They were told when they entered the land that a particular portion of Canaan would be allotted to them, and the line that's drawn there are the borders that are given in the text. The tribes each took a portion of that by lot after they had conquered the land. Notice that 3 of the tribes are outside the perimeter that was originally allotted. Those are what are called the Transjordan tribes, Reuben, Gad, and half of the Manasseh tribe, and they disappeared very quickly in history. They were the first ones absorbed by outside powers. But the Israelites lived primarily, even though they were given land all the way down to the Mediterranean, they stayed primarily in the hills, in the hill country, because the major trade route ran up along the coast. If you're a caravan and you're trying to get from, say, Egypt to Mesopotamia, the easiest way is up along the coast. And so all the major Canaanite cities were located along the coast and along the trade routes, and the hill country was off the major trade routes and very uncosmopolitan, and that's where the Israelites primarily centered themselves. The Canaanites, we are told, as a group, people living in Canaan lived along the coast and in the lowlands, which included the Great Rift, as you see there, and the Israelites were pretty much up in the hill country. Now, they did that for about 200 years. They lived, and that's what we read about in the time of the judges. They had judges that helped them, and they helped each other in times of trial, but basically they lived in the hill country for about 200 years until a new group of immigrants coming from the Aegean, starting sometime after 1200, came down the coast, conquered the Canaanite cities, and settled in that region as Philistines. They're what we call the Philistines. So when you read the Bible, the early part of Judges, there are no Philistines mentioned. They weren't there. And they show up much later during the time of the book of Judges, during the time of Samson, which is closing in on about 1100 BC. We would argue that the Passover was about 1400 BC, and that's a little different than what you'll see in your Bibles, but that's a time that fits much better with history. Your ESV and your NIV and the chronologies that you see in the back of your Bibles are calculated numbers that don't make sense historically. But they were adopted about 300 or 400 years ago, and they have become traditional numbers, but they don't work. Around 1400 BC, Egypt collapsed. We had the Passover. They would have had the conquest about 1350, and the Philistines start showing up 200 years later. And that's what the text shows. They fought a lot of people, but no Philistines until about the time of Samson. Now, you turn the page after the death of Samson, a little bit of time has passed, and we're now in the book of 1 Samuel, which incidentally was 1 and 2 Samuel were a single book as they were composed. But the Bible was translated into Greek. The Old Testament was translated into Greek about 250 BC because there were a lot of Jews around the world who didn't speak Hebrew anymore, and they wanted the text in a language they spoke. Alexandria, Babylon, places, Antioch, places around the Near East, and when they translated it into Greek, for some reason they broke the book into two parts. Probably because it's a big book, and that makes a huge scroll. And you'll notice that 1 and 2 Samuel are split in a place that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense literally. As far as literature, it's kind of an awkward position, and it was split right in the middle, probably to make two smaller scrolls. So anyway, we're in 1 Samuel here, and you have the entire life of Samuel. I'm not going to spend time on that. This was a young boy who was raised at Shiloh in the hands of a priest at Shiloh and was dedicated as a Nazirite, again, born to a woman who is described as barren and childless. And I pointed out last week that several women in the Bible are older, barren, and childless, and then they give birth to a child who is very important in the plan that God is laying out. We have Sarah with Isaac. We had the mother of Samson, who's unnamed. We have Hannah, who is the mother of Samuel. And then, of course, there's Elizabeth, who's the mother of John the Baptist. So here's another child who is dedicated to the Lord, to a woman who's gotten along in years, and she's described as barren and childless. And if we go back to that, it said that as he was raised as a Nazirite, she had committed him as well as Samson had been committed as a Nazirite. It says, all Israel from Dan to Beersheba recognized that Samuel was attested as a prophet of the Lord. The Lord revealed himself to Samuel through his word. And incidentally, Dan to Beersheba, you'll see that repeatedly in Judges and Samuel. Dan was the northernmost city. Beersheba was the city down at the edge of the Negev. And when you see Dan to Beersheba, basically that's like us saying coast to coast, border to border. It's just describing where most of Israel was located. So anyway, we have Samuel. We've had years passing since Samson died. We have Samuel serving as their prophet, their priest, their secular leader. And immediately we get into the story that the Israelites went out to fight against the Philistines. The Israelites camped at Ebenezer and the Philistines at Aphek. Now, this is the first major battle that the Bible talks about between Philistines and Israelites. They had kind of an uneasy, I think, coexistence up to the time of Samson. He was going to marry a Philistine woman, They were willing to accept an Israelite son-in-law, and then things went badly for them, and I think open hostilities began. We have another 15 or 20 years that have passed, and now there's a major attack by the Philistines against the Israelites at a place called Ebenezer. And it says, at Aphek, and that the Israelites were at Ebenezer. This is like the Civil War. We have Bull Run and Manassas, first Bull Run. The armies refer to where they camp. The battlefield is the same, but in this case, Ebenezer's on one side of the battlefield, Aphek's on the other. So that's all that means. This is the same place. And as the battle spread, Israel was defeated by the Philistines. Now, in those days, battles played out, especially with the Philistines. They're from the Aegean. They're Iliad and the Odyssey type people, and they're thinking a lot of their battles were between were combat mano a mano, one man fighting a duel to another, David and Goliath style. And the armies would line up, and they'd challenge each other sometimes for days or weeks. And there'd be little skirmishes at one end or another, but you didn't have a major battle necessarily unfolding right away. And that's what's going on here. The Israelites' days are unfolding and nothing's happening. The Israelites aren't doing well. So the elders said, let's bring the ark of the Lord's covenant from Shiloh so that it may go with us and save us from the hands of our enemies. In other words, they're going to go up to Shiloh. They're going to get the ark and bring it down as a talisman, as a good luck charm, so that they can then beat the Philistines. And this is a terribly blasphemous act when you think about it. So the people sent men to Shiloh. They brought back the ark of the covenant of the Lord Almighty, who's enthroned between the cherubim. We don't know what they were. They're some kind of a winged creature that was on the lid. They're generally represented as angels or other types of winged creatures, but we really don't know what the cherubim were. And they brought it back. The Philistines were terrified when they heard that the Ark of the Covenant had been brought into the camp. The battle unfolded, though. The Israelites were defeated. The slaughter was very great of the Israelites, and the Ark of God was captured by the Philistines. So let's take a look at the map here. This is the central portion of Israel. You can see the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River, which is the Jordan Valley. I've put Jerusalem in there, which was a tiny little insignificant city at this time, incidentally. About 10 acres, maybe 1,000 people, tiny little city, well fortified, but up in the hill country, a very unimportant city at the time. Ashkelon, Ashdod, these are all cities of the Philistines in the Philistine territory. Those are 4 of the 5 cities of their Pentapolis. But the Battle of Aphek is further up the coast. In other words, they seem to be trying to extend their territory. And Ebenezer is located just on the other side of Aphek. So here we are down in the foothills. We have Israelites up in the hills. We have the Philistines massed down in the foothills, and they're meeting and fighting at that particular point. Shiloh is an ancient cultic center, a Canaanite cultic center, that existed up in the hill country before the Israelites arrived. Very often there are cultic centers around the world that are taken over by one religion after another, the same spot. There's this fantastic place in Ortygia, Syracuse, a beautiful little church on the island of Ortygia, and today it's a Baroque church, very, very fancy church facade. But if you go in and take a look, the foundation was a Greek temple, and a Roman temple was built on top of it with its columns. And that was filled in and made into a church, which became a mosque at one point. Now it's back to a church again. They keep using the same place because this is a sacred spot of some sort. So anyway, they're up in Shiloh, and that's where the ark is located. So the men had to go up and get the ark, which is probably 20, 25 miles up into the hill. It would take them a day. Now, good soldiers could probably make it certainly in 4, 5, 6 hours. But when they got the ark, that's carried on staves, and you can't run with it. So it's going to be at least another day or a day and a half getting back down. So you have 2 or 3 or 4 days unfolding. Meanwhile, the battle's been there have been skirmishes going on. They took the ark back down to the battlefield. The battle unfolded. The Israelites lost. And the Philistines returned back to their Pentapolis, and they took the ark with them. So, it says, after the Philistines captured the ark of God, they took it from Ebenezer, which was their camp, to Ashdod. And in those days, what you would do is take these captured trophies into the temple and place them before the god as an offering. Quite often, they took your head off first. That's what they did when Saul died. They chopped his head off, took his armor as trophies and put those in the temple, and they nailed his body to the wall at Beit Shan. But anyway, they went to Ashdod. They carried the ark into Dagon's temple. Dagon was the chief god in this area, and he's not the highest of the Canaanite gods. That was Baal. They're not quite sure what Dagon was. Some say he was the god of fishermen, and we see images of him as a fish, perhaps. Others say he was the god of grain. But at any rate, he's their chief god, and they bring the ark in and set it at his feet as an offering and as a demonstration of their triumph over the Israelites. And the next day they went in, and Dagon had fallen over. And he's on his face before the ark of the Lord, which is a prostration of the god, and it shows the humiliation and subjugation of Dagon to Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. That was the significance of this. Well, they straighten him back up again. Oh, here's an example of that type of prostration, which is what everybody did before the kings. This is an Assyrian obelisk. It's probably about 8 or 9 feet tall, and it has a whole series of cartoon panels on it. It's about this wide, and it's square in cross-section, and it has all these panels. And this particular panel, if you enlarge it and take a look at it, it is Yah, the son of Omri. This is Jehu. This is one of the kings later on during the time of the Assyrians. But if you take a look at the pictures, you have an Israelite king on his hands and knees, prostrate before Shalmaneser. And this is typical. So when Dagon had fallen over in front of the ark, they're demonstrating that Yahweh was superior to Dagon. Well, the next morning, Dagon's fallen over again, but this time his head and hands are broken off and only his body remains. Now, this again is showing total domination of Dagon. You took the heads of your enemies. As a matter of fact, the Assyrians collected heads. The soldiers would kill their opponents, chop off the heads, put them in a pile, and then after the battle was over, they'd carry the heads over, and they would get credit for how many heads they had. So his head's been broken off. The Egyptians kept body counts by cutting off the right hands. You remove the hands, you remove the power. And so Dagon is lying there, no head, no hands. And this, again, is a demonstration of the power of Yahweh dominating Dagon. Here is an Assyrian relief, and you'll notice the soldier off to the left, but he has a pile of heads there that he's brought in. And these are being tallied up by the scribes, so he's getting credit for however many people he's dispatched. And, of course, the better warriors had bigger piles of heads. This is a relief from Egypt that shows a pile of hands. Now, you only took one hand. You couldn't, otherwise you could chop off 2 hands and get credit for 2 soldiers, so it was always the right hand. But, and then when the choir leaves, it always makes me wonder what I just said. People get up and I show the cut off hands and people get up and leave. They did an excavation in Egypt just recently, which was really kind of surprising. Notice it's a collection of chopped off hands. So this was obviously a place where hands had been counted and they just threw them into a shallow grave to cover them up. So you can see an assortment of hands there. But that's what's happened with Dagon. He's lost his head and his hand. And not only that, the people were suffering from tumors and devastation. And it says the Lord's hand was heavy upon the people of Ashdod. He brought devastation upon them and afflicted them with tumors. So what did they do? Let's get it out of town. Let's send it to the next town down the road. They sent it down to Gath. And at Gath, the same thing happened, and so they sent it to Ekron. So we've had a period of several months here where it says people who didn't die were afflicted with tumors. We find out later that they had some kind of a plague associated with rats. And you're never certain what those diseases are, but they did have plagues in those days and diseases that we have: typhoid, cholera, They had the Black Death. It wasn't as bad as what happened in the 1300s, but they had all of these diseases. And so what they did was react in an Aegean fashion. These are Greeks, or these are predecessors to the Greek regions. And it says, when the ark of the Lord had been in Philistine territory 7 months, the priests and diviners said, we should send it back. It's bringing us bad luck, let's send this back. And also what they would do is send an atonement gift of some sort. Make models of the tumors. How do you do that? And of the rats that are destroying the country, and pay honor to Israel's God. So that's what they did. We're told that they made models. Each of the cities made models of the rats and the tumors. They placed the ark of the Lord on the cart, along with a chest containing gold rats, and the models of the tumor, and they sent it to Beit Shemesh. And I showed you a picture of that area. That's right on the interface between the Philistine territory and the Israelite territory. Beit Shemesh was located right there. Now, I've always kind of chuckled over the idea of a king going into a goldsmith and saying, I want you to make a model of a tumor. I mean, we don't know what they look like. The rats, I understand. But there's a different translation to this story, and it's done by the Jewish Publication Society, which is a collection of Jewish scholars looking at the very same words that the Christian scholars have done. And they have translated it a little bit differently. The JPS means Jewish Publication Society. They make a Bible that has Hebrew and English side by side on the same page, and this is what Jewish Bible scholars would use in their services. And it says, the Lord struck the people of the city, young and old, so that, and they don't say tumors. They use an entirely different translation. And the very next verse goes on to say, they went to the goldsmith and say, you shall make figures of your hemorrhoids and the mice that are ravaging your land. Now, my question is very basic. If you're the goldsmith, you're going to say, what does a hemorrhoid look like? So anyway, that's I put that in there partly because it's amusing, but partly because it shows the difficulties of translating words that are used rarely or that have multiple meanings. You have to take it from the context. And Christian scholars, in their efforts to, I think, often sanitize the Bible, have chosen actually, the King James Version refers to them as emerods. So that may be a close parallel to the other English translation. So anyway, they sent the ark back, and it was brought to Beit Shemesh. We read of the problems that they had. A couple of men looked in the ark and were killed as a result. It terrified the Israelites, so they sent it to a town on the hillside called Kiryat Yearim. It said the men of Kiryat Yearim came and took up the ark of the Lord, and it was kept there until the time of David. David sent men down to get it and bring it to Jerusalem after he conquered the city, but this was about 75, 80 years later. So the Israelites didn't want the ark. It was dangerous, and the men of Kiryat Yearim, who were on the very edge of Israelite territory, were willing to take care of it, and they did so for the next couple of generations. Now, Samuel said, assemble Israel at Mizpah. We're going to have a convocation, we're going to have a meeting, and we're going to talk about your relationship with the Lord. And he goes on to say, I will intercede with the Lord for you. But if you look at where Mizpah is located, the Philistines in the purplish area had domination of the lower areas of the land. The Israelites were in the hill country. They had fought the battle at Aphek over on the coastal side, but Shiloh and Mizpah are located up in the very center in the highest portions of the Judean highlands. And what happened was the Philistines, probably down in the Great Rift, down in the lower areas to the east, heard that Israel had assembled at Mizpah. They came up to attack them. The Israelites were afraid. But the Lord thundered with loud thunder against them, threw them into a panic, and they were routed. And the men of Israel rushed out of Mizpah, pursued the Philistines, slaughtering them, so they were subdued and did not invade the Israelite territory again. This is the first example of an actual incursion by the Philistines up into the hill country that we know of. They were actually invading into the land. And if you look at the map again, basically what they were probably doing was coming up from the closest approach would be the Great Rift. And the battle went badly for them. They withdrew, and they didn't attack again. They didn't invade Israel. Hostilities continued, but again, the battles continued around the periphery or at the borders between the two, the interface. The towns from Ekron to Gath that they had captured were restored to her, and Israel delivered the neighboring territory from the power of the Philistines. So during the time of Samuel, they were able to keep the Philistines at bay. They didn't conquer them. David did that. But they were at least able to hold the Philistines at bay, but it frightened them apparently, because we're told that when Samuel grew old, he had appointed his sons as judges. This is typical. Priesthood was kind of a hereditary process, but we're told that the sons were dishonest. They didn't walk in his ways. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice, and the Israelites didn't want that. They're afraid of the Philistines. Samuel's getting along in years, and the heirs apparent are dishonest men. So they came to him and they said, "You are old. Your sons don't walk in your way, so appoint a king to lead us, such as all the other nations have." This is where they finally reached the point that they want to have a king assigned. Samuel was quite distressed. He said, "No, you don't want a king. You have a king. You have the Lord to lead you." And he went to the Lord, and the Lord said, Don't be upset." He said, "It's not you that they are rejecting. They're rejecting me, the Lord." And you see that here. They've rejected me as their king, as they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt. And if you follow the Exodus in the hundreds of years, there has been a revival and then a falling away from the faith and then a revival after punishment and then a falling away. He said, "They're just rejecting me again." So he says, "Go ahead and accede to their demands. Listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will reign over them will do." So he went back and he said, "You don't want a king? He's going to take your sons and daughters and make them work for you. He's going to appropriate your flocks and your fields and give them to his cronies. You don't want a king. He'll turn you into slaves." And they said to him, "No, we want a king over us." They refused to listen to Samuel. Then they go on to say, "Then we will be like other nations with a king to lead us and go out before us and fight our battles." They wanted a military leader. They wanted someone to protect them. And actually, Saul was very successful at that. He did hold them at bay. He fought the Philistines repeatedly as well as other enemies. The Lord said, "Okay, give them a king." And he instructed Samuel in a process by which he would learn who it was that God had selected. There was a Benjamite, a man of standing whose name was Kish. He had a son named Saul, an impressive young man without equal among the Israelites, a head taller than any of the others. Big, strapping, good-looking man who's a head taller. This is like George Washington. Apparently, George Washington, at a time when men were 5'6", he was well over 6 feet tall. And this is impressive and always has been. So now we have, and the average the average consensus would be that Saul was about 30 years old at this point. His name was Saul, and the problem was he was a Benjamite. People didn't want a Benjamite, and why not? Now, unfortunately, it's a very upsetting story. I don't have time to go into it, but basically, he was from the tribe of Benjamin, which is located in the central portion of the country. And it was just north of Jerusalem and just up from the destroyed city of Jericho, to give you a location there, as you can see on the map. But the question is, why were the Benjamites despised? And the answer is in Judges 19. I would suggest you read that. Basically, it's a story of a Levite and a concubine, and she was killed, and the Israelites were appalled at what had happened in the city of in an Israelite city. They massed together against the Benjamites. They demanded that the men who had committed the atrocities be brought out. They were not. They were protected by the Benjamites. And so the Israelite armies went to war with the Benjamites and nearly wiped them out. It said, after defeating the Benjamite armies, the men of Israel went back to Benjamin, to the tribal area, put all the towns to the sword, including animals and everything else they found. In other words, they almost literally wiped out the tribe, realized at the very last moment they were going to lose a tribe, so the survivors were given wives, and they were basically rebuilding their numbers a couple of generations later. So here we have a tiny little tribe that's still despised for what they had done. And Saul is a Benjamite, and they were appalled. Getting back to the story, it says the donkeys belonging to Saul's father, Kish, were lost, and so they said, take one of the servants and go and look for the donkeys, and this will bring him into contact with Samuel. And Saul's incidentally introduced as a donkey wrangler. He's sent in search of donkeys. This sounds unimpressive, but in those days, kings rode donkeys. This is a very wealthy man, and his donkey, David rode a donkey. Solomon was taken down to the Gihon spring to be anointed on a donkey. They didn't have horses up in the hill country in those days. They were too expensive, too difficult to take care of, and they didn't do well in the hill country, not for a couple of generations later. So Saul is introduced as a donkey wrangler. David would later be introduced as a shepherd. And, of course, Jesus is introduced as a shepherd. So these are images that would resonate with the people of those days. And when the Lord revealed to Samuel that he should give them a king, he said, I'll send you a man from the land of Benjamin. Anoint him leader over my people. He will deliver my people from the hand of the Philistines. In other words, God's acceding to the demands of the people for a king. And Saul, when he was identified by Samuel later on, he said, but I'm a Benjamite from the smallest tribe in Israel. They'd been nearly wiped out just a few years before. And is not my clan the least of all the clans of the tribe of Benjamin? In other words, if you're a bit of a skeptic, as I am, God is saying, okay, I'll give you a king, but I'm going to give you a man who is probably one of the most despised of the Israelites. He's going to be from Benjamin, from the smallest tribe. And he's going to be your king. And actually, it didn't turn out well, as we'll see next week. Samuel said, the Spirit of the Lord will come upon you in power, and you will be changed into a different person. And this is indeed what happened. As Saul turned to leave Samuel, God changed Saul's heart, and these signs were fulfilled that day. So we have a man who was taken from the tribe of Benjamin. He returned home. Samuel summoned the people of Israel to Mizpah again for a convocation, and they brought Saul out, and he was a head taller than any of the others, it says. Big, strapping, good-looking young man. And Samuel said, do you see the man the Lord has chosen? There's no one like him among all the people. And the people shouted, long live the king. But some troublemakers said, how can this fellow save us? They despised him and brought him no gifts. So it did not start well for him. He went home, and then we're immediately given the story of Nahash the Ammonite, who was besieging the city of Yabesh in Gilead. And Nahash said, I'll make a treaty with you, but only on the condition that I gouge out the right eye of every one of you and bring disgrace on all Israel. Basically, what he's saying is that there would be much greater fame for me if I destroyed the city. He's besieging a city. This takes time. You can't really attack a city in those days very well. You're on foot. They didn't have siege equipment as such. So he's been surrounding the city, and they said, we will give up. And he said, that's fine, but I need some kind of a sign that I've conquered you. I'll take your right eyes. That way, he destroys their ability as soldiers. You can't shoot a bow. You're really handicapped if you've lost an eye. You've lost your depth perception and so forth. And so the elders of Yabesh said, give us 7 days. Let us talk it over. They're besieging him out there. There's no way they're going to break into the city right away. And if no one comes to rescue us, we will surrender to you. They apparently got word out to Saul, and it goes on to say he mustered the Israelites, separated his men into 3 divisions, and during the last watch of the night, which is right before dawn, when people are most tired, least vigilant, and probably mostly asleep, they broke into the camp of the Ammonites and they slaughtered them. So he relieved the siege, and Samuel then said to the people, let's go to Gilgal, let's go back down to where we crossed the Jordan River originally when we came into the land, and we'll reaffirm the kingship. And so all the people went to Gilgal, and they confirmed Saul as king in the presence of the Lord. He's now demonstrated his military prowess, and he's now accepted by the people. If you take a look here, basically it played out this way. The tribe of Benjamin is where Saul was located at that particular point. The city of Gibeah is an area where he was located primarily. Across the rift, we have the city of Ammon today, but that was the center of the Ammonites. And a little bit north in Gilead was the city of Yabesh. So this was a city that was being besieged, and Saul took his army across. This would have taken a couple of days at the most, attacked the city, destroyed the Ammonites, who were from Ammon, and then they went back down to Gilgal, where they had originally crossed the Jordan River after the Exodus, and they were at Gilgal there. The city of Jericho was destroyed at that point, and Gilgal was probably just a tent camp where they had been. And he was reaffirmed as king at that point. Now, one other thing, 40 years later, he was killed at Mount Gilboa up there where you see the explosion sign, and his body was taken to Beit Shan, which was a Canaanite city immediately adjacent to the area where the battle took place. And the people of Yabesh, this is a generation later, his body, the head was cut off, his body was nailed up to the wall of the city as a display of their triumph. The people of Yabesh went across, this was a full generation later, and retrieved his body and took it back and buried it and honored it for what he had done at the beginning of his kingship. So now we have a king. Finally, we have a king. And Saul was about 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 42 years, according to your Bibles. The problem is the 30 and the 40 are calculated numbers. We don't know how old he was. We don't know how long he reigned. But working the story out based upon the other events, they've come up with these 30 and 42 years. If you look at the Jewish Publication Society, which is the Jewish scholars interpreting this as opposed to Christian scholars, they say he was ... They leave a blank, so they don't know how old he was, and they say he reigned over Israel 2 years, and they state it just like you see there, and that's, frankly, I think that's silly. He could not have accomplished the things he did, and it doesn't fit into the rest of the story for 2 years. But the point is, we don't have any text anywhere that is intact and gives the numbers as they were originally written. So they've kind of calculated the 40-year reign for Saul. Okay, King Saul. Finally, we have a king. Next week, we're going to talk about David and Goliath. That's fun. Great story. We're going to talk about the death of Saul. And we're going to talk about the inauguration of David as king. And so a lot of fun there. We do have a couple of minutes if anybody has any questions or wants to offer opinions. Yes?
Not to disagree with the Jewish interpretation, but if they had rats in the plague, it was the bubonic plague, and buboes were tumors, which were easily found in the armpits, the neck, anywhere.
Yeah.
So is there any possible definition that these were actually tumors other than what the Jewish...
The question is whether the plagues were bubonic plagues associated with rats, and that would be my particular interpretation. There were different outbreaks of bubonic plague throughout history, some of them more severe than others, and the really bad one happened in the 1300s with the Black Death that pretty well wiped out a third of Europe. But there are disagreements as to what this particular disease would have been, but I think bubonic plague is a pretty good guess because of the rats. And then, of course, the hemorrhoids, maybe that was just adding insult to injury, I don't know, but that's a lot of fun. Yes?
Didn't the Philistines have better metal and better weapons than the Israelites at that time?
Yes, we'll probably get into that next week. Iron technology had been developed by the Philistines. The Israelites were still using basically Bronze Age technology. They had bronze swords, In fact, in one of the major battles between Saul and the Philistines, it points out that only he and Jonathan had iron swords. Everybody else would have had bows and arrows and slings. They would have had perhaps bronze weaponry, but the iron technology at that point was controlled by the Philistines. And we're told that they had iron farm implements in Israel, but they had to bring them down into Philistia to get them repaired and sharpened. So we have and not only that, the Philistines were a very militaristic people when they arrived. They had been driven out of the Aegean around 1200 BC, and they fought their way down the coast all the way to Egypt before they returned back and settled on the coast. They had iron technology, and they were militaristic. The Israelites were basically gentlemen's soldiers. You know, they were farmers and average people that would take up weapons to go fight. So there was a tremendous inequality between the two groups at that particular time. But with the Lord's support and with the way things unfolding, eventually domination of the Philistines was accomplished by David, and he was able to conquer the Philistines. Yes?
So I sort of understood that the reason Saul was picked was that it was Benjamin was the youngest son. It was the smallest city. So from God's perspective, even though he didn't want them to have a king, if there was going to be one, there would be one coming out of humility, which would be the smallest city from the youngest son.
Did you all hear that? They're pointing out that the tribe of Benjamin had been nearly exterminated a couple of generations before and was still a very small tribe. And Saul points out that he is from the least of the clans, in other words, a very insignificant family, and it was God's purpose to bring Saul to a position of kingship to show that even from the least you can, is that basically what you're saying?
Yeah, that's how I understood it.
And that's probably a very good interpretation. There were men that were very unhappy with the selection of Saul until he relieved the siege at Yabesh Gilead and was able to demonstrate that he was indeed a military leader, and he was quite effective at controlling the Philistines until he was finally killed by the Philistines at Mount Gilboa, and we'll see that next week. So it's time to quit. Thank you. We'll talk about it next week.
Bible Interact, uncovering the mysteries of the kingdom of God. At BibleInteract.tv, you will penetrate the scriptures of the Bible. At our store, you're just one click away from owning your favorite books, DVDs, or study guides. Earn a degree from our university and watch hundreds of video presentations from biblical scholars, archaeologists, and theologians. By subscribing to Bible Interact, you'll find all the resources you'll need, so why not subscribe today? Go to www.BibleInteract.tv. You'll be glad you did. Interested in studying more about the temple, the Messiah, or what God's plan is for our future? No problem. We've got you covered. With more than 200 DVDs, books, and workbooks, you'll find the answers you've been searching for. Bible Interact, uncovering the mysteries of the kingdom of God.